The sun was a merciless god in this part of the West, a white-hot coin hammered flat against an endless blue sky. It baked the land until the earth cracked like old leather and the wind did nothing but move the heat around, whispering through the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti and carrying dust that tasted of grit and forever. This was a land of hard edges and little forgiveness, a place that demanded everything from a man and promised nothing in return. It was this land that Elias called home. He rode tall in the saddle, a quiet man whose silence was carved from the vast, empty spaces he traveled. For 10 days, he'd been on the trail, tracking a band of horse thieves who had grown too bold, pushing them east until they scattered like quail. Now, his work done, he was returning. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, plodded onward, its head low with exhaustion. Elias was no less weary. The dust had settled into the lines around his eyes, and his shoulders ached with a familiar, bone-deep fatigue. As the small, weathered shape of his ranch appeared on the horizon, a cabin, a barn, and a newly fenced corral shimmering in the heat haze, his mind drifted back, as it often did, to the day this life had begun. A year ago, he hadn't been a rancher. He'd been a man chasing bounties, living by the speed of his draw and the sharpness of his instincts. But instincts could fail. An ambush in a narrow canyon had left him with a shattered leg and a bullet wound in his side that bled his life out into the thirsty sand. He remembered the blinding pain, the buzzing of flies, and the slow, cold certainty of death. And then he remembered her, Clara. She had appeared like a mirage, a figure in a white dress, torn and stained with mud, her face pale with fear, but her eyes burning with a fierce determination. He learned her story in fragments, through feverish dreams and moments of pained consciousness. She was a bride, or had been for a few hours, fleeing a marriage brokered by her uncle to a man 3 times her age with cruel eyes and a reputation for breaking things, including his previous wives. She had slipped out of the church just after the vows, stolen a horse, and ridden until the animal collapsed from exhaustion, leaving her stranded in the same unforgiving wilderness that was claiming him. She found him by chance, a dying man half buried in the sand, with a strength he couldn't comprehend. She had dragged him to a small line shack abandoned by prospectors, cleansed his wounds with whiskey from his own saddlebag, and stitched him up using a needle and thread from her small sewing kit. For weeks, she nursed him. She hunted rabbits with a snare made from her own hair, found water in places he would have overlooked, and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice when the fever took him. He had woken one dawn to find her sitting by his cot, her hands clasped in her lap, watching him with an expression of such profound loneliness that it struck him deeper than any bullet. In those slow weeks of healing, a bond formed between them, spun from shared vulnerability and the raw need for survival. He saw the decency in her, the quiet fortitude. She saw, perhaps, a protector, a man whose strength, once returned, could shield her from the world she had run from. He didn't love her, not in the way the poets wrote about. Love, for him, had been a wildfire, a consuming blaze he'd known once before, and it had left him scarred. What he felt for Clara was a different kind of warmth, gratitude, deep and abiding, mixed with a tender protectiveness and a quiet admiration. It was a foundation, he thought, something solid. When he was strong enough to stand, he'd looked at her, a woman with no family, no home, and a past that was hunting her. He owed her his life. The only honorable thing to do, the only right thing, was to offer her his name and his protection. So he married her. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling preacher, with the wind as their only witness. Now, their life on the ranch had fallen into a rhythm, as steady and predictable as the rising sun. From the back of Dust Devil, he could see her, a small figure moving in the vegetable garden she had painstakingly coaxed from the stubborn soil. It was her patch of defiance against the desert, a square of green life in a world of brown and gray. She worked from sunup to sundown. Her hands, which he remembered as being soft when they first touched his fevered brow, now calloused and strong. He built things, a new corral for the horses he planned to raise, a sturdy chicken coop, a porch on the front of the cabin where they could sit in the evenings. Their days were filled with the silent language of shared work. He would chop wood, and she would stack it. She would cook, and he would clean. They were a partnership, efficient and peaceful. On the surface, it was a good life, the kind of settled existence many folks in this territory dreamed of. But beneath the calm surface, an invisible current flowed, a distance that neither of them knew how to cross. Their affection was real, but it was also hesitant, restrained. It existed in the gentle way she would place a plate of food before him, or the way he would instinctively place himself between her and any stranger who came to their door. Yet, it faltered in the quiet moments. In the evenings, sitting on the porch, the silence between them would often stretch until it became heavy, thick with unasked questions and unspoken truths. They slept in the same bed, but often it felt like they were miles apart. Two solitary sleepers lying side by side, their backs turned to one another. It felt as if they were both guarding a secret part of themselves, a past they had agreed not to speak of. And that silence had become a wall, solid and unbreachable. He never asked more about the man she had fled, and she never asked about the life he'd led before her, about the shadows that sometimes flickered in his gray eyes. They lived in the present they had built, but their pasts were ghosts in the house. As Elias drew closer to the ranch, he saw the sky to the west was changing. The brilliant blue was being swallowed by a wave of roiling, yellow-brown dust. A sandstorm was coming, one of the vicious ones that could strip paint from a wagon and blind a man in minutes. He urged Dust Devil into a tired trot, anxious to get the horse into the barn and secure the shutters on the cabin. Clara had seen it too. She was already hurrying from the garden, her apron full of tomatoes, her head bent against the rising wind that was beginning to whip her skirts around her ankles. He dismounted at the barn, giving his horse a quick rub-down before leading him into a stall with fresh hay and water. He could hear the storm now, a low moan that was steadily growing into a deafening roar. He ran for the cabin just as the first great wall of sand hit, plunging the world into a gritty, suffocating twilight. He slammed the door shut behind him, the latch clicking into place just as the full force of the storm descended. The wind shrieked and howled, and fine dust began to seep through the tiny cracks in the window frames and under the door. Clara was lighting a lantern, her face illuminated in its soft, golden glow. "You made it just in time," she said, her voice calm, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. "It's a bad one," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. He moved to the window, peering through the glass at the maelstrom outside. The world had vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of sand and fury. They settled into the familiar silence, listening to the storm rage. It was a sound that made their small cabin feel like the only safe place in the world, an island in a sea of chaos. He felt a familiar surge of gratitude for her, for this life, this sanctuary. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was his. And then he saw it. Through a momentary lull in the swirling sand, a shape emerged from the gloom. At first, it was just a dark, lumbering shadow, indistinct and ghostly, but it kept coming, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose against the force of the wind. It was a horse-drawn wagon, the kind used by travelers or settlers. But no sane traveler would be out in a storm like this. They would have hunkered down hours ago. This wagon wasn't seeking shelter. It was heading directly for them. Clara saw it too. She moved to stand beside him at the window, her hand unconsciously gripping his arm. The warmth of her touch through his dusty shirt was a small, solid thing in the growing unease. "Who would be out in this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Elias didn't answer. He watched as the wagon drew closer. the horse straining, the driver a hunched figure against the storm. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, the tranquility of his life, so carefully constructed, so precariously balanced, suddenly felt as fragile as glass. He had a sense, deep and certain, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside their home. The wagon was not bringing a lost traveler. It was bringing the past, and it was a past he realized, with a dreadful clarity, that he had never truly escaped. The wind died as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. The world outside the cabin window was painted in bruised, apocalyptic hues. The sun, sinking low, bled through the thick haze of settling dust, casting a blood-red light across the land that made the familiar landscape seem alien and menacing. Elias stood frozen, his hand still on the window frame, watching the wagon creak to a halt not 20 yards from their door. The horse, its hide caked with dust, hung its head and heaved. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cabin was a tomb of silence. Even the dust motes dancing in the lantern light seemed to have paused. Beside him, Clara was rigid, her breath held tight in her chest. Then, the wagon's canvas flap was pushed aside, and a woman stepped down onto the ravaged earth. Time, for Elias, fractured. The woman was thinner than he remembered, the lines of her face sharpened by hardship. But there was no mistaking her. The same cascade of dark chestnut hair, the same proud set of her shoulders, the same way she tilted her chin in defiance of the world. Sarah. The name was a ghost on his tongue, a wound he thought had long since scarred over, but now it was open and raw again. 5 years. 5 years since she had vanished from his life without a word, without a note, without a trace, taking with her the part of him that knew how to burn with passion, leaving only cold ash behind. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of shock and a rage so old it felt like part of his own skeleton. But the storm of his emotion was cut short, silenced by what came next. 2 small figures scrambled out of the wagon after her, a boy and a girl, miniatures of each other, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes ragged. They moved to stand slightly behind Sarah, their small hands clutching the folds of her skirt. They were perhaps 5 years old, and as they looked toward the cabin, their faces turned up in the dying, crimson light. The air was stolen from Elias's lungs. It was the eyes. They were his own, the same shade of gray, deep-set and serious, holding a quiet, watchful stillness that was a perfect reflection of the one he saw in the mirror each morning. It wasn't just the eyes. The boy had the same high bridge of his nose, the same stubborn set to his jaw. The girl, her hair in 2 dusty braids, had the same slight tilt of her head when she was uncertain. He saw his own father in them, and his father's father. It was the undeniable stamp of his blood, a truth so stark and absolute it struck him with the physical force of a blow. He was no longer a man. He was a statue, rooted to the floorboards of his cabin, the world narrowing to the 2 small faces staring at him from across the yard. Beside him, Clara made a small, strangled sound, a whisper of pain. He felt her hand fall away from his arm as if scorched. When he dared to tear his gaze from the children and look at his wife, her face was a mask of pale, frozen disbelief. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the scene outside, but they looked through it, as if seeing the fragile foundations of their life crumble to dust. The standoff stretched into an eternity. The red sun sank lower, casting long, distorted shadows that reached like accusing fingers toward the cabin. Sarah stood her ground, her expression unreadable. She offered no smile, no apology, no sign of remorse. She simply waited, letting the impossible truth of the children's existence do her work for her. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was rougher than he remembered, frayed by the wind and years he knew nothing about, but it cut through the heavy air with brutal clarity. They need their father, Elias. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a judgment, a simple statement of fact that landed in the center of his world and blew it apart. It laid the blame, the responsibility, the entire crushing weight of the past 5 years, squarely at his feet. He heard a sharp intake of breath, and then the soft scuff of boots on wood. Clara turned, her movement stiff and mechanical, like a porcelain doll. She did not look at him. She did not look back at the woman and children outside. Her gaze was fixed on the far wall of the cabin, on a future that had, in the space of a single minute, become terrifyingly uncertain. She walked away from the window, crossed the room, and quietly pushed open the door to their bedroom. She stepped inside and closed it softly behind her. The click of the latch was as final and as deafening as a gunshot. Elias was alone, trapped between the closed door of his present and the woman who embodied his past. He forced his legs to move, his boots heavy as lead. He unlatched the cabin door and stepped outside. The air was cool now, and thick with the smell of dust and distant rain. He walked until he was standing 10 feet from her. He looked at Sarah, the woman he had once loved with a suicidal intensity, a love that was all lightning and fire, the woman who had ripped his heart out and left him to bleed. And then he looked down at the children. The boy was staring at his boots. The girl, braver, met his gaze, her gray eyes wide and curious. His children. His asterisk. The word was a foreign country. He was a husband, a rancher, a man who had built a quiet life on a foundation of gratitude and duty. He was not a father. Yet, the proof stood before him, breathing the same dusty air, their small faces a living testament to a love he had tried to bury. The anger at Sarah's betrayal was a hot, familiar poison in his veins. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to rage at her for the years of silence. Why did she leave? Where had she been? Why come back now, to this life, his life with Clara? But the fury was choked by a new, terrifying wave of emotion. It was a fierce, primal pull toward the 2 small strangers who carried his face. He saw their weariness, the way they huddled close to their mother for safety. He saw the tattered edges of their shoes and the hollowness in their cheeks. They were his, and they were in need. He could not be the man who turned his back. The betrayal Sarah had dealt him was a thing of the past, a wound between 2 adults. But the innocence of these children was the present, and their silent gaze held a claim on him more powerful than any vow. He had loved Sarah with a reckless passion that had nearly destroyed him. He had married Clara out of a solemn sense of honor that had saved him. Now, caught between the ghost of that fiery love and the quiet reality of his duty, he was paralyzed. Who was he? The man betrayed? The husband? The father? He felt like a stranger to himself. He said nothing. He simply knelt, slowly, onto one knee. So he was at eye level with the children. He didn't know what to say. The silence stretched, and he simply looked at them, at the impossible truth of them. The little girl took a hesitant step forward, her hand letting go of her mother's skirt. "Are you him?" she whispered, her voice small. "Are you our PA?" Elias couldn't find his voice. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. That night, the storm was gone, but a deeper tempest raged within the 4 walls of the cabin. Sarah and the children slept in the main room, the twins curled together on a pallet by the cold hearth. Sarah in a chair, her head resting against its high back, as if she were a guest who had no intention of staying long. Elias lay in his bed, in the room he shared with his wife. Clara was there, a rigid line on her side of the mattress, her back to him. The space between them was a canyon, a vast and uncrossable void. The air was thick with the things they were not saying, with the questions she had every right to ask and the answers he did not have. He could feel her silence like a physical weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, to say, "What?" "I'm sorry, I didn't know." The words were meaningless. empty shells against the enormity of what had happened. He turned onto his back and stared into the oppressive darkness. The image of the children's faces was burned into his mind. His son, his daughter. He thought of Clara, the woman who had saved his life, the woman he had sworn to protect, lying beside him now. A stranger separated from him by a secret he hadn't even known he was keeping. He had built this quiet life, this fragile peace, brick by brick. And, in a single, dust-choked evening, the past had returned and leveled it all. The night was long and starless, dense with secrets. And for the first time since Clara had found him dying in the sand, Elias felt utterly and hopelessly alone. The dawn brought no clarity, only a gray, washed-out light that seemed to leach the color from the world. The cabin was a tinderbox of unspoken tensions. Elias had moved Sarah and the children's things into the small loft space, a temporary solution to a problem that felt devastatingly permanent. Breakfast was a silent, miserable affair. The children, Jacob and Lily, ate with the wide-eyed caution of wild animals in a strange place. Clara moved with a brittle, chilling efficiency, placing plates on the table without a word, her face pale and set like stone. She did not look at Elias. She did not look at Sarah. Her entire being had contracted into a tight, guarded knot of pain. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice cutting through the silence as Elias was about to escape to the barn. "We need to talk. Elias." He followed her outside, the morning air cool against his skin. They stood by the corral, the horses watching them with passive curiosity. He leaned against the fence, crossing his arms over his chest, a defensive posture he didn't even realize he was taking. Sarah began, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I know you hate me," she said, her voice flat. "You have every right, but you need to know why I left." He waited, his silence a wall of judgment. "It was my father," she said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes, once so full of fire, were shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. "He had arranged a marriage for me, to a merchant from back east, a man named Alistair Finch. He was rich, powerful. My father saw it as an alliance, a way to secure our family's future." Elias's jaw tightened. He remembered her father, a hard man with cold eyes and a cruel smile, who had always looked at him as if he were something to be scraped off a boot. "I told him no," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I told him I was going to be with you. I was going to run away with you that very night. We were going to build our own life. Remember?" He remembered. The memory was a sharp, twisting knife in his gut. He had waited for her by the old cottonwood tree until the sun came up, a fool with a heart full of plans. "He told me if I went to you, he would destroy you." Sarah's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "He said he would have you arrested for cattle rustling. He said he had friends, a sheriff who owed him, men who would lie under oath for a price. He would see you hang. Elias, he swore it, and I looked in his eyes, and I knew he meant it. He would have seen you dead before he saw you with me." The story was a plausible kind of poison, seeping into the cracks of his old anger. It was exactly the sort of cruel power play her father would have made. "So I married Finch," she said, the words tasting like ash in her own mouth. I thought I was saving you. It was the only choice he gave me. The next morning, Finch took me east. I didn't know I was carrying the twins until 2 months later." She finally broke, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Finch was a monster. When he found out the children weren't his, he was cruel. I stayed as long as I could. For them, I waited until my father died last year. Once he was gone, I knew Finch couldn't use him against me anymore. I took the children and I ran. We've been living hand-to-mouth ever since, moving from town to town, until I worked up the courage to find you." She looked at him, her entire story laid bare in her desperate, pleading eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Elias. Not for a single day. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done." He didn't know what to believe. His mind was a battlefield, the betrayal he had nursed for 5 years warring with the image of him swinging from a rope. Had she saved him? Or was this just another lie, a convenient story to win his sympathy? He looked past her, toward the cabin. He saw Clara's silhouette pass by the window, a fleeting shadow. His wife. He had a wife, a life, a duty. "You should have told me," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You should have trusted me." "And what would you have done?" she shot back. "Fought him? Gotten yourself killed? I chose your life over my happiness. I've been living in hell for 5 years because of it." He had no answer for that. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the fence, her story hanging in the air between them like a shroud. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing torture. The ranch, once his sanctuary, became a prison of strained silences and averted gazes. Clara was the ghost at the center of it all. She became cold, distant, a stranger in her own home. The gentle warmth that had been the bedrock of their marriage was gone, replaced by a brittle chill. She spoke only when necessary, her words clipped and devoid of emotion. She poured all her energy into her work, tending the garden, scrubbing the floors, mending clothes with a frantic, desperate intensity, as if she could scrub away the presence of Sarah and the children. He tried to reach her one evening as she was washing the dishes. He came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Clara," he began softly. She flinched as if his touch were a hot iron, pulling away so sharply that a plate slipped from her wet hands and shattered on the floor. She didn't look at him. She simply knelt, methodically picking up the broken pieces, her face a blank mask that concealed a universe of pain. Her message was clear: "Do not touch me." The wall between them was now made of ice. Her jealousy was a silent, suffocating thing. It wasn't in loud accusations or angry tears. It was in the way her eyes would follow Sarah, a quick, hard glance full of suspicion. It was in the way she would call the children inside for a meal just as Elias was beginning to talk to them. She never raised her voice, never said an unkind word, but her misery was a palpable presence in the cabin, a constant low hum of despair that set everyone's teeth on edge. Sleep offered no escape. Elias found himself lying awake long after the others were asleep, his mind churning. He was torn between a past that demanded justice and a present that was disintegrating before his eyes. One night, the silence of the bedroom was too much to bear. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Clara, and went outside, needing the vast, starry sky to keep from suffocating. A faint flicker of light from the barn caught his eye, thinking it might be a fox near the chickens. He moved silently toward it. As he drew near, he heard a sound, a soft, choked sob. He peered through a crack in the wooden slats. There, in the pale glow of a single lantern, was Clara. She was kneeling in the hay, her back to him. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. In her hands, she held a piece of paper, a letter it looked like, old and creased, torn in half. She held it to her chest as if it were a sacred relic, whispering to it, her words lost in the sound of her own weeping. Elias had never seen her cry. Not once. Not when she'd told him about the forced marriage she'd fled. Not even when she'd spoken of the fire that had supposedly claimed her entire family. To see her like this, completely undone, secretly weeping over a torn letter in the dead of night, was deeply unsettling. It was a glimpse into a hidden well of sorrow he never knew she possessed. He backed away, unseen, his heart heavy with a confusion he couldn't name, and retreated to the house. Her story about the fire, it had been one of the first things she'd told him. Her voice quiet but steady. A tragic accident that had left her an orphan, alone in the world save for the cruel uncle who saw her as property. He had accepted it without question. Why would she lie about such a thing? The next day, driven by the memory of her secret grief, he did something he knew he shouldn't. While Clara was out in the garden and Sarah was occupied with the children, He went to the small wooden chest at the foot of their bed where Clara kept her few belongings: a spare dress, a family Bible with no names written in it, her sewing kit. His hands felt clumsy and intrusive as he searched. Tucked into the Bible, he found it. Another piece of paper, folded small. His fingers trembled as he opened it. It was the other half of the letter. The handwriting was faded, elegant. The letter was dated 2 years ago, long before she had met him. He scanned the words, his blood running cold. Most of it was mundane, talk of weather and the price of corn. But then, one sentence leaped out at him, branding itself into his mind. "Do not worry for me, my dearest Clara. My health is much improved, and your mother sends her love. We pray for your safety every night. Asterisk, your mother sends her love." The words echoed in the silent room. Her mother, her family. They weren't dead. They had not perished in a fire. The entire foundation of her story, the tragedy that had defined her in his mind as a lone survivor, was a lie. He stood there, holding the 2 torn pieces of her past, his world tilting on its axis. Sarah's return had been a shock, a sudden storm that threatened to tear his house down. But this was an earthquake. It shook the very ground he stood on, cracking the foundation of everything he thought he knew about the woman who had saved his life. A cold, venomous suspicion began to coil in his gut. He looked back on that day she had found him, bleeding out in the desert. He had seen her as an angel of mercy, a kind soul in a desperate situation. But what if she wasn't? What if she was just a different kind of survivor? A woman on the run who stumbled upon a wounded man and saw not a person to be saved, but an opportunity, a protector, a husband, a shield. Had she saved him out of compassion, or out of a calculated need for her own survival? Who was this woman he had married? The gentle, selfless creature who had nursed him back from the brink of death? Or a clever liar who had built their entire life on a foundation of deceit? He looked out the window at her, on her knees in the garden, tending to the green shoots with a loving, careful hand. And for the first time, he felt a chilling, terrifying doubt. He didn't know her at all. The lie sat between them like a corpse at the dinner table. Elias's discovery of the torn letter had changed everything. The quiet, hesitant affection of their marriage was gone, replaced by a cold, watchful suspicion on his part and a brittle, defensive silence on hers. The air in the small cabin was thick with the poison of unspoken accusations. He found himself studying her, re-examining every memory, every gentle touch, every soft word, searching for the artifice he was now certain was there. Was her kindness just a tool? Was her quiet nature a performance? He felt like a fool, a man who had built his house on a foundation of sand. And the tide was coming in. Sarah, with an animal instinct for weakness, sensed the widening chasm between them and began to exploit it. She did it subtly, with remarks that were as sharp and painful as a needle under the skin. Over dinner, she would sigh and say, "Do you remember that summer by the river, Elias, when we thought we could live on nothing but wild berries and each other?" She would watch Jacob trying to whittle a piece of wood and laugh softly. "He has your hands. You know, the same way you held that knife when you carved my initials into the old oak tree." Each memory was a stone she threw into the still, dark waters of their life, creating ripples that lapped at the edges of Clara's composure. She was drawing a circle around herself and Elias, a circle of shared history that Clara could never enter. It was a silent, brutal siege, and Clara was being starved out. Elias, lost in his own storm of doubt and betrayal, did nothing to stop it. A part of him, the part that still ached with the memory of Sarah's fire, found a grim satisfaction in it. His suspicion turned him into a hunter in his own home. He watched Clara constantly. He noticed how she would startle when he entered a room unexpectedly, how her eyes would dart toward the small wooden chest where she kept her secrets. One afternoon, he was mending a fence on the far side of the property when he saw a flicker of movement near the cabin. He stayed low, using the rolling hills as cover, and watched. It was Clara. She saddled her mare with a furtive haste, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be seen. She stuffed a small, cloth-wrapped parcel into her saddlebag and rode out, not toward the open range, but toward town. A cold certainty settled in Elias's gut. He quickly saddled Dust Devil and followed, keeping a safe distance. The 4-mile ride to the small, dusty town of Redemption was tense. He watched her, the woman he had married, moving like a fugitive. She dismounted in front of the general store, but she didn't go in. Instead, she walked directly to the post office. Elias tied his horse 2 streets over and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows of the covered boardwalks. Through the grimy post office window, he saw her at the counter. She handed a letter to the clerk, along with a few coins. Elias moved closer, his heart pounding, straining to see. He saw the clerk dip the stamp in ink and press it onto the envelope, and on the line where the sender's name would be. He could just make out the name the clerk was reading back to her for confirmation. One letter from a Miss Abigail Fowler. Abigail Fowler. The name meant nothing to him. It was another lie, another mask. His eyes narrowed, trying to see the addressee. He couldn't make out the full name, but he saw enough. Care of the Nightingale Hotel. St. Louis. It wasn't a family name. It was an anonymous, transient address. The kind a person used when they didn't want to be found. The rage that had been simmering in him for days finally boiled over. He waited until she was on the trail back. Then he cut across a ridge and intercepted her in a thick grove of cottonwoods. The silence of the woods a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He blocked her path, and she pulled her horse to a halt, her face instantly pale when she saw the look in his eyes. "Enjoy your ride into town, Clara?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. I needed some thread," she stammered, her hand straying toward her saddlebag. "Is that what they call it now?" he shot back, dismounting and stepping toward her. "Who is Abigail Fowler?" Her face crumpled. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking fragile and terrified. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me!" he roared, the sound exploding in the quiet woods, startling a flock of birds into flight. "Not anymore. I found the other half of the letter. Clara, the one that mentions your mother. The mother who was supposed to have died in a fire." Tears welled in her eyes. "Elias, please. Who are you sending letters to in St. Louis? Who are you hiding from?" He grabbed the reins of her horse, his knuckles white. "I took you in. I gave you my name, my protection. I married you, and it's all been a lie. Every single bit of it." "No!" she cried, the word torn from her. "Not all of it." "Then tell me the truth," he demanded. "For once in your life, tell me the goddamn truth." She finally broke. Sobs shook her entire body as the carefully constructed walls of her past came crashing down. "My name, it isn't Clara Miller," she whispered through her tears. "The man I fled, he wasn't just a groom my uncle chose. It was an arrangement." Elias stared at her, a cold dread creeping over him. "What kind of arrangement?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "I was a bride for hire," she said, the words barely audible. "My family was destitute. We were losing our farm. They found an agency, men from the West who would pay for a wife. They paid my father's debts. They paid for my passage. I was bought. The man I was sent to, he was cruel before we even left the church. I saw the way he looked at me, the way he treated the horses. I knew I couldn't go with him. So I ran." Bride for hire. The words hung in the air, ugly and cheap. It was worse than he could have imagined. His marriage, his life with her, wasn't just built on a lie. It was a business transaction. He was the unwitting fool who had picked up another man's paid-for property. He felt a wave of revulsion and humiliation wash over him. He had been used. She hadn't saved him out of kindness. She had saved him because she needed a protector, a replacement for the one she'd run from. "The letters," he said, his voice numb. "Who are they to?" "The agency," she wept. "They're looking for me, the man I ran from. He's a client of theirs. He wants his money back, or he wants me. I send them letters with false names, to different places, to make them think I'm still moving, to lead them away from here, to protect you." "To protect me?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You've done nothing but lie to me from the moment we met." He let go of her reins as if they were contaminated. He felt utterly betrayed, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He turned his back on her and walked away, unable to even look at her anymore. That night, the sky unleashed a fury that matched the turmoil in Elias's soul. A violent thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, and lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder. Elias sat at the table, staring at nothing, while Clara huddled in their bedroom. Sarah tried to calm the twins, who were terrified by the storm's violence. Suddenly, there was a sound louder than the thunder, a deafening crack, followed by the sickening splintering of massive timbers. The whole cabin shook. Elias was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a lantern and running for the door. "The old oak by the barn," he yelled. A bolt of lightning had struck the massive, ancient tree, and a huge limb had broken off, crashing directly onto the corner of the barn roof. He ran outside into the deluge, Sarah right behind him. The scene was chaos. The roof had caved in, and the horses were screaming in terror inside the damaged structure. "The children!" Sarah shrieked, her face white with horror. "They're not in the loft. Jacob said they were going to make a bed in the hay. They love to sleep in the barn during storms." A cold terror, sharper and more immediate than any betrayal, seized Elias. He started for the gaping dark hole in the barn wall, but just as he reached it, another section of the roof groaned and sagged, ready to give way. It was a death trap. But before he could even process the danger, a figure shot past him. It was Clara. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream or call for help, with her face set in a mask of pure, feral determination. She plunged into the unstable barn, disappearing into the darkness and chaos. He heard her voice, clear and commanding over the storm and the panicked horses. "Jacob! Lily! Answer me!" A moment later, he saw her, struggling back toward the opening, dragging both children with her. Jacob was crying, but Lily was limp in her arms, just as they cleared the doorway. The rest of the roof collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a shower of splintered wood and debris down where they had been seconds before. Clara fell to her knees in the mud, shielding the children with her own body. Elias ran to her, his heart in his throat. Jacob was fine, just scared. Lily had been knocked unconscious by a falling piece of wood, but she was breathing. Clara herself had a long, deep gash on her arm where a piece of timber had caught her, bleeding freely into the rain and mud. She ignored it completely, her only focus on the children, stroking their hair, whispering to them, her face a torrent of rain and tears. Elias stood frozen in the storm, looking at her, the calculating liar, the bride for hire, the woman who had used him. None of those images fit the woman kneeling in the mud before him, bleeding and battered, having just run into a collapsing building to save his children, her children. In that moment of pure, selfless instinct, he saw a truth that no confession, no lie, could ever change. Whatever her past was, whatever secrets she kept, her love was real. It was fierce, it was protective, and it was absolute. And that knowledge was more terrifying than any lie she had ever told. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the world smelling of wet earth and pine. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained heavy and charged, thick with the aftermath of chaos and revelation. Elias cleaned and bandaged the gash on Clara's arm with a tenderness that felt foreign and clumsy in his own hands. She submitted to his care with a quiet, unnerving stillness, her eyes fixed on the floor, her face pale and drawn. He could feel the tremors running through her, the shock not only of the accident but of the night's raw, emotional exposure. For the first time since Sarah's arrival, they were touching, connected by this small act of care, and the space between them hummed with 1,000 unspoken words. From across the room, Sarah watched them, her arms crossed, her face a thunderous mask of resentment. Clara's selfless act had done more to win Elias's sympathy than any of Sarah's carefully chosen words. She saw the shift in him, the way his anger had been replaced by a deep, troubled confusion, and she knew she was losing him. The next few days were a fragile, agonizing truce. Elias threw himself into rebuilding the barn, working until his muscles screamed and his mind was too numb to think. He was a man caught in a cross-current, ripped in 3 different directions. There was his duty to Clara. She was his wife. She had saved him once from death and had now saved his children from the same fate. He owed her a debt that felt sacred and unbreakable. Then there was the ghost of his love for Sarah, the mother of his children, a woman whose own story of sacrifice, if true, demanded a compassion he struggled to feel. And finally, most powerfully, there was the burgeoning love for Jacob and Lily. He found himself watching them, memorizing the cadence of their laughter, the serious set of Jacob's brow as he concentrated, the way Lily's eyes lit up when she saw a wildflower. This love was a raw, fierce, and terrifying thing. It was an anchor, and every decision he made now had to be measured against its weight. His life was no longer his own. Sarah saw her window of opportunity closing. She cornered Elias one evening as he stood by the corral, watching the last vestiges of sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The children were asleep inside. "She's a liar, Elias," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "Everything she's built with you is a falsehood. Can't you see that?" "It's not that simple," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It is," she insisted, stepping closer. "It's the simplest thing in the world. Look at them. Look at Jacob, at Lily. They are our children. We are a family. That is real. That is truth. Everything else is a shadow." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch a familiar fire. "We can have it back, Elias, everything we lost. We can raise our children together, here, in this home." "And Clara?" he asked, the name feeling heavy in his mouth. Sarah's face hardened. "She can go back to whatever life she ran from. She has no place here. This is our home, our family. You just have to choose." Her voice dropped, becoming sharp and edged with steel. "But know this, if you don't choose me, if you choose to stay with a woman who bought your loyalty with a lie, then I will leave, and I will take my children with me. You will never see them again. I swear it." It was a cruel, perfectly aimed blow, and it struck him where he was most vulnerable. The thought of losing the children, of their faces fading from his life forever, was a physical pain, a tearing in his chest. Sarah had laid out the choice in the starkest possible terms, his past and his future, or his present duty. Clara, from the cabin window, saw the exchange. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the desperate intensity on Sarah's face, saw her hand on Elias's arm, and saw the profound, tormented conflict in the rigid set of his shoulders. And in that moment, she understood. She was the problem. Her presence, her lies, her tainted past. She was the wedge driven between this man and his children, between a family that deserved a chance to be whole. The guilt she had been carrying became an unbearable weight, crushing the last of her hope. She believed, with the grim certainty of a broken heart, that the only truly loving act she had left to perform was to disappear. That night, when the house was steeped in the deep, quiet breathing of sleep, Clara rose from the bed she no longer felt she had a right to. She moved like a phantom in the moonlight that streamed through the window, gathering the few meager possessions she had arrived with, a spare dress, her sewing kit. She left behind the warm quilt he had bought her, the sturdy boots, all the small comforts of a life she had only been borrowing. She sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where their life of strained silence had played out, and by the light of a single, low-burning candle, she wrote. The words poured out of her. A final, desperate confession. The truth she owed him. Asterisk, my dearest Elias. Asterisk, I write this knowing I have no right to use such a word, but in my heart, you will always be so. By the time you read this, I will be gone. Please do not try to find me. My leaving is the only gift I have left to give you. Asterisk. The story of my life as I told it to you was a lie, born of fear. My family is not dead. They are poor, hard-working people who, in a moment of desperation, made a choice that I have had to live with. They sold me. It is an ugly truth, but it is the truth. I was to be a wife for a man I had never met, in exchange for enough money to save our farm. They called it an arrangement, but I was property. Asterisk. The man who bought me was a monster. I saw it in his eyes. I ran, and I have been running ever since. When I found you, I saw a good man, a kind man, but I was also a desperate woman. I needed a shield, and you were my salvation. I am ashamed to admit that my actions, at first, were driven by survival. I clung to you because I was drowning, and you were the shore. Asterisk. But somewhere along the way, survival turned into something else. It turned into respect. It turned into a deep and quiet affection. It turned into love. My love for you, Elias, is the only part of my story that has ever been true. I never lied about my feelings for you. I love you with everything I am, with the entirety of my broken soul. I love the quiet strength in you, the kindness you try to hide. I even love the children, Jacob and Lily, as if they were my own. Asterisk. But a love built on a lie cannot stand. You deserve a life built on truth. With the mother of your children, you deserve the light. My past is all shadows, and I will not let them darken your home any longer. I am not worthy of your light. Asterisk. Please, be happy. Be a father to your children. Forget the woman who lied to you. That is all I ask. Asterisk yours, in a way I never deserved to be. Asterisk Clara, though that is not my real name. It is the one in which I learned to love you. She folded the letter, placed it on his pillow, and slipped out of the cabin, melting into the pre-dawn darkness. Elias woke to an empty bed. A chilling stillness in the room alerted him that something was wrong. Then he saw the letter. He read it once, his mind struggling to take in the words. He read it a second time, and the world shifted. The anger he had held on to, the sense of betrayal, it all dissolved, washed away by a wave of staggering, heartbreaking clarity. He saw it all now, not as a cold deception, but as a desperate fight for life. He pictured her, terrified and alone, making an impossible choice. He saw her lies not as a betrayal of him, but as a shield to protect herself, to protect her family, and ultimately, to protect the new life she had so cautiously built. She had been running for her life, and he, in his anger and pride, had become just one more man who had judged her without understanding the depths of her fear. He thought of Sarah's love, a possessive, demanding fire that had burned brightly and then abandoned him. And he thought of Clara's love. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a hearth, a quiet, steady warmth that had asked for nothing, a love that had healed him, worked beside him, and ultimately had been willing to sacrifice everything, including itself, for his happiness. Her heroism in the storm hadn't been an isolated act. It was who she was. Her entire life with him had been one long act of selfless protection. He held the letter in his hand, the paper a fragile testament to her pain and her love. And he knew, with a certainty that cut through all the confusion and doubt, that he had been a blind fool. Sarah was the past. The children were the future. But Clara Clara was his heart. Her love was the truest, most solid thing he had ever known, and he had just let it walk away. He didn't hesitate. With Clara's letter clutched in his hand like a prayer, he strode back into the cabin where Sarah was just beginning to stir the morning fire. She looked up, a question in her eyes, but it died when she saw his face. The conflict was gone. In its place was a resolve as hard and sharp as flint. "She's gone," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "It's for the best. Elias," Sarah began, her voice soft and placating. "Now we can—" "There is no way," he cut her off, his voice flat and cold. "There is you, the mother of my children, and there is me, the husband of the woman who just left. I'm going after her." Sarah's face paled. "You can't be serious. After everything she—" "I know what she is," he said, his gaze unwavering. "She's the best person I've ever known, and I was too blind to see it." He walked to the hearth, taking down his rifle and checking the action. "The children need their mother. I expect you to be here for them when I get back." The implication was clear. Her role was defined. There was no negotiation. "But I am going to find my wife." Without another word, he turned and walked out. He packed his saddlebags with ruthless efficiency. Jerky, a small bag of oats for Dust Devil, his canteen, a spare box of cartridges, and Clara's letter, which he folded carefully and placed in his inner pocket, against his heart. He saddled his horse and rode out as the sun was just cresting the horizon, a bloody smear of orange in the east. He didn't look back. The world beyond his ranch was a vast, brutal canvas of rock and heat. He pushed himself and his horse to their limits, chasing a ghost. He rode through a landscape of silent, accusing saguaros that stood like forgotten sentinels, their arms raised to a merciless sky. He navigated treacherous canyons where the rock walls radiated the sun's heat like a furnace, and the only sound was the lonely echo of his horse's hooves. At night, he would lie wrapped in his bedroll, staring up at a cold blanket of stars, the distant, mournful howl of a coyote, a perfect match for the ache in his own soul. He stopped at every dusty way station, every lonely trading post, every ramshackle settlement. "I'm looking for a woman," he'd say, his voice growing hoarse. "About so high, with quiet eyes. Looks like she's carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders." The descriptions he got back were a frustrating mosaic of maybes. A barman in a place called Purgatory Creek thought he'd seen a woman like that boarding a stagecoach heading west. A prospector swore he'd shared a fire with her 2 nights ago, and she was heading north, toward the mountains. Every lead was a dead end, every trail a phantom. The wind, the eternal, indifferent wind of the prairie, seemed to delight in erasing her tracks, in wiping away any trace that she had ever been. Days bled into a week, then 2. His supplies dwindled. His hope, a flickering candle flame, was threatening to be extinguished by the relentless wind of failure. He was in the foothills now, a broken land of scrub brush and shattered rock, when he came upon a small, secluded encampment of Ute Indians nestled by a stream. He approached slowly, his hands raised in a sign of peace. An old man with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes as dark and knowing as the night sky met him. Elias, through a mix of broken Spanish and sign language, described Clara. As he spoke, a younger brave who had been watching from a distance stepped forward. "I know this woman," the brave said in clear, measured English. His name was Kono. "She came to us in the last moon. She was lost, and her heart was heavy." Elias's own heart leaped. "Where did she go? Is she all right?" Kono looked at him, his gaze steady. "She is a woman of great spirit. When she came, the fever was upon our people. The children were weak, and our medicine man was old and tired. This woman, she did not run from the sickness. She stayed. She knew of herbs, of white man's remedies. She brewed teas and cleaned the sick with her own hands. She sat with the dying and sang soft songs to the children." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. It was her. It was exactly what she would do. One day, Kono continued, his voice softening. A horse, spooked by a snake, bolted through the camp. It ran toward my sister's child, a small boy, before any of us could move. This woman, your woman, she threw herself in front of the child. She did not hesitate. The horse struck her, a glancing blow, but it threw her against the rocks. Her shoulder was wounded, her body bruised, but the boy was untouched. Kono pointed to a small leather pouch tied to his own wrist. She saved my nephew's life. She saved many of our people. We gave her a horse and food. She rested until her strength returned. And then she continued on. She said she was heading north, toward the high passes. She said she was looking for a place where the shadows could not find her. The story settled over Elias, not with a shock, but with the quiet, profound weight of truth. This was the final piece of her soul, the part he had been blind to. This was who she was when no one he knew was watching. This was her character, forged in selflessness and courage. He thought of her saving his children, and now this Ute boy. He thought of her letter, of her feeling unworthy. The injustice of it all, the cruelty of a world that would make such a woman feel shame, finally broke him. He turned away from Kono, leaned his head against Dust Devil's warm flank, and wept. The tears came in great, silent, racking sobs, washing away the last of his pride, his anger, and his foolish judgment. He understood then. Love wasn't a name. It wasn't a clean past or a convenient story. It was an action. It was a choice. It was throwing yourself in front of a frightened child. Not once, but twice. It was nursing the sick when you could have walked away. Her love for him had been the same. A constant, selfless act of protection. The lies she told were the walls she had built to shelter that love, to keep her shadows from touching him. He thanked Kono and the old man, leaving them what little coffee and tobacco he had left. He rode out with a renewed sense of purpose, a fire in his belly that burned away his fatigue. He was no longer just searching. He was atoning. He pushed north, into the high country, the air growing thinner and colder. He was reckless now, his mind consumed with a single goal. He was leading his horse through a narrow, rock-strewn gully when the horse shied violently. At the same moment, Elias felt a sharp, searing pain in his calf, as if he'd been jabbed with 2 hot needles. He looked down and saw the diamond-patterned tail of a rattler disappearing under a rock. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, washed over him. He knew he had only minutes. He ripped his knife from its sheath, tore the fabric of his trousers, and made 2 deep, criss-crossing cuts over the fang marks, the pain making him gasp. He pressed his mouth to the wound, sucking and spitting, the venom's coppery taste filling his mouth. Then, he took a handful of black powder from a cartridge, poured it into the wound, and with a trembling hand, struck a match. The powder ignited with a flash, cauterizing the flesh. The agony was blinding, white-hot, and he collapsed against the rock wall, his body slick with a cold sweat. He lay there for a long time, drifting in and out of a feverish haze. The world swam around him, a blur of rock and sky. But through the pain, one image remained sharp and clear in his mind. Clara's face. He saw her kneeling in the mud, her arm bleeding as she protected his children. He saw her whispering to a torn letter in the dead of night. He heard her voice in his memory. "I am not worthy of your light." "You're wrong," he rasped to the empty canyon. The pain was a fire in his leg, the fever a fog in his head, but the fire in his heart was stronger. He would not die here. He would not let his story end this way. He had to find her. He had to tell her that her love was the only light he had ever truly needed. Gritting his teeth against the waves of agony, he used his rifle as a crutch and dragged himself to his feet. He pulled himself into the saddle, his body screaming in protest, leaning low over Dust Devil's neck. He pointed the horse north, deeper into the wilderness. He was wounded, half delirious, but he was moving. His heart had only one compass point, one direction, one purpose: to find the woman who had dared to love him with all her pain, and to finally be the man who was worthy of that love. The venom was a relentless fire in his veins, and the fever it birthed was a thick, suffocating fog. Elias rode slumped in the saddle, clinging to consciousness by a thread, his world a swimming blur of pain and shimmering heat. Dust Devil, sensing his master's weakness, plodded onward with a steady, determined gait, following the barely there trail leading north. Elias was driven by a single, hallucinatory image that burned behind his eyes: Clara's face, pale and tear-streaked, mouthing words he couldn't hear. He was losing time, losing himself, but he could not, would not, lose her. He was on the verge of collapsing, of surrendering to the blackness that clawed at the edges of his vision, when he saw it, through the wavering air. So faint it might have been a mirage. A thin, gray wisp of smoke curled into the sky. It came from a dense thicket of aspen and pine crowded along a fast-moving river. Hope, fierce and desperate, jolted him upright. He urged Dust Devil forward, the horse scrambling down a rocky embankment toward the trees. There, half hidden by overgrown brush, was a small, dilapidated cabin, a relic left behind by some long-forgotten trapper. The roof was sagging, the door hanging crookedly on a single leather hinge, but smoke was trickling from its mud and stick chimney. He slid from the saddle, his wounded leg buckling beneath him, and staggered toward the door, his heart hammering with a terrifying mix of hope and dread. He pushed the door open. The cabin was a single, dark room, filled with the smell of wood smoke and sickness, and on a crude cot made of pine branches and old blankets, she lay, Clara. Her face was flushed with fever. Her hair, damp with sweat, was plastered to her forehead. A small, smoky fire struggled in the hearth, a pot of water steaming beside it. She was alone, delirious, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The injury from the horse, raw and untended, had become infected. She was burning up from the inside out. For a moment, he forgot his own searing pain. He stumbled to her side, falling to his knees. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry crackle. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her cheek. She was radiating heat like a furnace. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, looking through him. She murmured something, a name that wasn't his, and then her eyes slid shut again. The roles were now perfectly, terribly, reversed. She had been his savior. Now he, wounded and half-dead himself, had to be hers. A strange clarity cut through his feverish haze. He would not let her die. He refused. He forced himself to move, his body a symphony of agony. He limped to the river, filling his canteen with icy water. He tore a strip from his own shirt, soaked it, and returned to gently bathe her face, her neck, the pulse that beat frantically at her wrist. He tended to the fire, coaxing it back to life. He found the herbs she had likely gathered, yarrow and willow bark, and brewed a bitter tea, forcing a few drops between her cracked lips. The night became a long, desperate vigil, a battle fought on the edge of life and death in a forgotten corner of the world. All the masks, all the walls of pride and hurt were stripped away, leaving only two raw, vulnerable souls clinging to each other in the darkness. He tended to his own throbbing leg, the snakebite a dull, angry fire, and then he would turn back to her, his universe shrinking to the space of that small, rickety cot. He murmured to her, telling her stories of his own childhood, of his dreams, of his foolish pride. He confessed his own blindness, his stupidity, begging her forgiveness in a low, continuous whisper. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he had to say the words. They were a poison he had to draw out of his own soul. Sweat, tears, breath, and memory all mingled in the close, dark air of the cabin. He was her nurse, her confessor, her anchor to the living world. In the deepest hours of the night, in the throes of her delirium, she began to speak. Her voice was a broken whisper, a stream of unfiltered consciousness from the depths of her heart. She murmured about her home, about the shame of her family, about the cold fear of being sold. He had dead eyes, she whispered, her own eyes wide and unseeing in the firelight. Like a shark. I couldn't let him touch me. Then her fevered gaze seemed to find him, to truly see him. A look of profound, heart-wrenching love and sorrow filled her eyes. Elias, she breathed, her hand weakly reaching for his. I'm so sorry I lied. Tears began to stream from the corners of her eyes, tracing paths through the grime on her temples. I just wanted to be safe. I love you. Don't leave me in the dark. Please, don't leave me. Hearing those words, so pure and desperate, spoken from a soul stripped of all artifice, shattered the last of his control. The love he felt for her, a love he had only just come to understand, swelled in his chest until it was an unbearable, beautiful pain. He was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion, grief for her suffering, rage at his own cruelty, and a desperate, clawing fear that he might still lose her. He leaned down, his own face slick with sweat and tears, and captured her lips with his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a raw, desperate claiming, a fusion of two agonies. It was a kiss of apology, of worship, of absolute, soul-deep need. It tasted of salt and smoke and fever and desperation. It was the most honest thing that had ever passed between them. She responded instinctively, a soft sigh escaping her lips, her hand clutching his shirt. The world outside the cabin, the past, the future, Sarah, the children, the lies, it all ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this desperate, primal connection. In that space between life and death, they found each other. He gently lay down beside her on the narrow cot, his wounded body crying out in protest, but he ignored it. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, sharing his warmth, his life force, his very breath. It was more than passion. It was a reconciliation of the flesh and the soul, a fierce, silent vow made in the heart of the wilderness. It was the rebirth of a love that had been buried under the weight of secrets and fear, a love that was now, finally, free. When the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, Clara's fever broke. She awoke slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. She was weak, her body aching, but her mind was clear. The first thing she saw was Elias, asleep beside her, his face inches from her own. He was pale, gaunt, a dark, angry-looking wound on his calf. But he was there. His arm was draped protectively over her, his breathing slow and steady. Memories of the night flickered in her mind, a chaotic mix of nightmares and fever dreams. But through it all was the memory of his presence, his voice, his touch, the desperate, life-affirming pressure of his lips on hers. Tears of a different kind, tears of disbelief and overwhelming relief, welled in her eyes. He stirred, his own eyes fluttering open as if he had sensed her waking. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, saying nothing. All the pain, all the lies, all the distance was gone. There was only a profound, quiet understanding. Elias, she whispered, her voice rough. Your leg. It'll heal, he said, his voice thick with sleep. He reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Just like we will. He saw the fear, the old uncertainty, begin to creep back into her eyes. He tightened his grip, holding her gaze. Your past doesn't matter to me, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. Whatever your name is, wherever you came from, it does not matter. I know who you are. You are my wife. You are the bravest, kindest soul I have ever known, and I will not live without you. He leaned in and kissed her again, gently this time, a kiss of promise, of beginning. I'll protect you, he vowed. From them, from the world, From everything, I swear it." The journey back was slow, a pilgrimage of two wounded souls healing together. He found both their horses grazing by the river, and they rode side by side. He tore a piece of his blanket and fashioned a sling for her arm. She, in turn, insisted on redressing the wound on his leg each evening. Her touch gentle and sure. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer heavy with secrets. It was a comfortable, shared space, a silence of complete understanding. As they finally crested the last ridge and saw the ranch nestled in the valley below, their home, Elias reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his without hesitation. They rode the last mile that way, hand in hand, their grip tight and sure. They were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance and gratitude, but a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, returning home to begin their life, for the first time. In truth, they crested the final ridge as a single unit, their hands still clasped, and saw the ranch below. A figure was standing on the porch, watching them. Sarah, beside her, standing very still, were Jacob and Lily. As Elias and Clara rode into the yard, the silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the tired snort of the horses. Sarah's eyes took in everything in a single, sweeping glance. Their joined hands, the makeshift sling on Clara's arm, the raw wound on Elias's leg, and the profound, unbreakable peace that now existed between them. Whatever she had hoped for, whatever fight she had left in her, withered and died in that moment. She saw not a victory for a rival, but the simple, undeniable truth of a man who had found his home. Elias did not belong to the memory of their shared past anymore. He belonged to this woman. That evening, the conversation was quiet and devoid of anger. They sat at the kitchen table while the children slept. Three adults caught in the quiet aftermath of a storm. "I'll be leaving in the morning," Sarah said, her voice flat, resigned. She did not look at Clara, but addressed her words to Elias. "The children, they're better off here, with you." Elias looked at her, seeing for the first time not the woman who had betrayed him, but a fellow survivor, a mother who had fought her own desperate battles. "You don't have to go, Sarah, they need their mother." Sarah finally looked up, and her eyes met Clara's. For the first time there was no animosity, only a weary, shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman in this harsh world. "They need a home asterisk," Sarah corrected him gently. "A stable one, not a life on the run with a mother who is always looking over her shoulder. They'll have that here, with you, and with her." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward Clara. "I saw her with them, after the accident. She loves them. That's all that matters." She stood, her movement stiff. "I'll write. I'll come back to visit when I'm settled, but their life is here now." She left as she had arrived, in the gray light of dawn. She hugged her children tightly, her face buried in their hair, whispering promises he couldn't hear. Then she climbed into her wagon, took the reins, and drove away without a backward glance. Elias, Clara, and the two children stood on the porch and watched until the wagon was just a small, lonely speck disappearing into the vast, indifferent prairie. 2 weeks later, Elias rode into Redemption and spoke to the traveling preacher. The wedding was nothing like their first. This was not a hushed, desperate affair born of duty and circumstance. This was a celebration, a declaration. They held it in the open air, under the vast blue bowl of the western sky, right in front of the small cabin they had built together. Their neighbors came from miles around, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and a genuine, burgeoning respect. Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious gossip, arrived bearing not whispers but a freshly baked apple pie. Stern-faced ranchers who had only ever grunted a greeting to Elias now shook his hand firmly and tipped their hats to Clara, their eyes holding a new, quiet approval. The story of her bravery at the barn had spread through the territory like a grass fire. Clara wore a simple blue dress, one she had sewn herself, and in her hair were a few wildflowers that Lily had picked for her that morning. She stood before the preacher, not as a fugitive or a purchased bride, but as herself, her past acknowledged but no longer a source of shame. Jacob stood beside Elias, trying to mimic his father's solemn stance, and Lily held Clara's hand, her small fingers laced tightly with hers. When the preacher asked Elias for his vows, he turned to Clara, his voice clear and strong, meant for her and all the world to hear. "I took you as my wife once out of a debt of honor," he said, his gray eyes shining. "Today, I take you as my wife out of a love so deep it has become the very ground I stand on. You are my home, my heart, and my truth. I will spend the rest of my days being worthy of you." When it was her turn, Clara's voice trembled, but her gaze never left his. "I came to you in shadow, and you gave me light. I came to you with nothing, and you gave me everything. My real name is Anna," she said, the name falling into the quiet air, a final secret given freely. "But I will be Clara, your wife, for all my days. For in that name, I found a home. In you, I found my life." The community accepted them. The whispers about Clara's mysterious past died away, replaced by a quiet admiration. She was no longer a stranger, but one of them, a woman who had faced down storms, both real and metaphorical, and had emerged stronger. She became a fixture in the small community, known for her gentle skill with healing and her fierce, protective love for her new family. The story closes on a perfect, blood-red evening, the kind that only the West can offer. The sky is a masterpiece of crimson and gold, and the long shadows of the saguaros stretch across the land like sleeping giants. 4 figures on horseback ride across the prairie, their silhouettes dark against the dying sun. Elias rides tall and proud, his wife beside him. On a small pony in front of them rides Jacob, and nestled securely in Clara's arms is Lily, her head resting against her new mother's chest. They are not running from a past or toward an uncertain future. They are simply riding together, a family forged in fire and truth. They move as one across the vast, endless plains, a landscape that was once a symbol of hardship and loneliness, but is now a kingdom of their own making. It is a place where love, raw and real, was finally found amidst the dust and the loss, a testament to the fact that even in the most unforgiving of lands, the human heart can find its way home. The seasons turn, the ranch prospers, the laughter of children echoes in the once silent cabin. One afternoon, while picking up supplies in Redemption, Elias is handed a letter by the postmaster. "Strange one, this," the old man mutters, peering over his spectacles. "Came all the way from St. Louis, from some official-looking agency, asking questions." He squints at the letterhead. "Something about a runaway bride, a contract broken. They're looking for a woman named Anna. Sent a description. Sounds a bit like your missus, don't it?" He winks, handing the letter over. "Good thing her name's Clara, eh?" Elias takes the letter, his face unreadable. He looks out the post office window, toward the distant hills where his home, his family, and his wife are waiting. The sun is bright, the sky is clear, but a long, dark shadow has just fallen across their peaceful land. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts.